we're starting a new sermon series to pull up the anchors and set sail from the familiar. It's a bit emblematic of this idea that if you push away from the dock and the boat starts to drift away, you will see the familiar. And for a while, that's all you'll know, and you'll want to go back. And on the other hand, if God has something planned for you that is on the other side of whatever it is that you're traversing, then that plan is so great and so grand and so much more possible than where you've been. The thing is that we have to recognize when we have drifted away, or we also want to recognize when God has drawn us to himself in a special way that we think our life hasn't made much of a difference. But if you really look back, you see how far you've come. The thing that reminds me of this is if you have an infant and you've ever had a child in the family and it's just 6 or 8 months old and it's in a car seat. Well, if it falls asleep and you're going to take that child somewhere, you put the child in a car seat, it may stay asleep. And then you put it in the car and then you can go anywhere. When you get there, there might be other people there who love to hold a baby. The thing that dawned on me is that when the baby wakes up, the baby's only going to know that it was asleep at home in the crib and now woke up in a strange environment with strange people. And has no idea how it got there. I think that's true of our faith. Both that after years of being faithful to the Lord and to our relationships, to our responsibilities, there's still a difficult moment that'll happen in your life. And the little voice of God, that whisper of God that says, look how far we've come. This is not something that is just going to end you, that's going to bury you. Look back in your life. And it's easy for us as Christians to forget the blessings and the journey along the way. And if you do, you can start to see the shoreline of where God is taking you. You may not be able to see where you've been, but you can certainly see the wake in the water of what the boat has been doing. And you look back and you go, how far have we come? How great is it to watch our children get older and do incredible things? How great is it to become an adult in our own right and find a career and live out that career with integrity and biblical principles? When you're able to do that, you have done this gap, this time lapse of which God has done extraordinary things in your life. The same can also be true if you haven't lived according to God's will. You might be out there and saying, yeah, I've actually gone the other direction. I went farther inland. I knew God wanted me to get on the boat. I couldn't see where he wanted me to go, and since he wasn't going to show me right away, I decided to go the other direction. Kind of like Jonah. Instead of going to Nineveh, you go absolutely the other way. But God made us to fulfill a purpose in us according to his will. And in order to do that, there is a point in our life, and often a decision to make, that I need to take my feet off of this place, put it into this vessel, and allow God to be the captain that takes me where he leads. One of the ways we do that is in worship. That this new sermon series means departing from the familiar, even in worship. So one of the first challenges that I have for you, if you're just listening to this video and you haven't been and stepped foot in a church, you're missing out. Hebrews 10:25 makes it clear, do not give up the gathering together. I share with our church that we're the gathering that is becoming. And what I mean by that is that when we come together and worship together, we're honoring God. We're gathering together to celebrate his glory. Now you may watch a football game, you may enjoy it from home, but there's nothing like it as to being in the stadium. We have a lot of Cardinals fans and some Cubs fans. Seems to me there's a lot more Cardinals fans around these parts. Even though we live in Illinois and we should be White Sox fans, but that's another story. If you're here and you're at your home watching the game, then maybe you enjoy the game, but it's still nothing like going to the ballpark. Well, that's true about us in our faith too. God made us to be communal people. One of the things that requires of us, not even as a suggestion, but something that God expects, is that we come together to worship him. And worship means that ship part. We're using it with the metaphor of a ship actually leaving the dock and leaving the familiar. But it simply means a state of being. And the state of being that we want to continually be in is ascribing God worth, that part of worship. Now, if you ask that question, do I really need to ascribe God worth? Isn't God worthy regardless of my worship? There's a little theology to this. many ways you can look at it and say when God created us, not simply his incarnation in Jesus Christ, but in creating us, there is a self-limitation to God's character. And it goes to this extent. He created us imago Dei, the image of God. We're image bearers. And we all know that if somebody does something that is a part of our family that is disrespectful to our name, that represents a poor reflection on us, then that doesn't ascribe us worth. It actually takes something away. So the assumption that a person could go through life and not honor God in worship and still be a good person or still not sin or do bad things, we miss the point. Our reason for existing is to be in communion and community with God. He affords that through Jesus Christ. But make no mistake, all of creation is growing, Romans 8:22. Groaning for the restoration of creation with God, its creator. That's true of the human heart as well. So the idea that I don't have to worship is silliness. It's an expectation of all of us. And I share with people a simple illustration of this, that there's times where we think the reason we don't have to worship is because we're our own person, that we do our own thing and God does God's own thing. But Psalm 24:1 says, the earth is the Lord and all that's in it. So that means that essentially to not ascribe worth to God, to not return the worthiness of God from his creation, you and me, and all of creation, is an act of rebellion against God. I think of it like the teenage son who doesn't like the house rules anymore, coming home after curfew and the parents saying, look, you need to come home, we want to know that you're safe. And the young man says, you know what, I'm really tired of these rules. I think it's kind of ridiculous. I'm of an age, I can take care of myself, I don't need you guys to babysit me anymore. Why do you need to know when I'm coming and going? You know, the routine. And so the son decides to get in the car and he takes off. Well, police officers shine the lights and they pull the car over and they go up to the car. And of course the son immediately assumes this is because he has been truant, that he has not been home after curfew, and so he's getting in trouble. His parents call the cops for him to come home, and he rolls down his window and he says, officer, I can explain. I'm not going home anymore. You don't need to take me home. I'm not going back to be with my parents. The officer was a little confused and said, actually, we're not here to take you back to your parents. We're here to take you to jail. Escorting the young man out of the car and into the police vehicle. And it's a little bit shocking. Would parents go to that extreme? Would you decide that if your child disowned you in some way, that you wouldn't remind them of the fact that the vehicle that they drove off with was in your name? See, that's what the young man didn't realize. It wasn't simply that the parents assumed a relationship as equals. It was the fact that the parents made a lot of provisions for the young man that he seemingly overlooked. We all do that. We say it's my car, or it's my house, or it's my job. And yet in a moment's notice, is that anything that you really possess? That we're here today and gone tomorrow, that we return to God, and that God, when we return to him, bestows upon us a judgment to remind us, you were the created, I am the creator. What I offered you on earth, everything around you was for your pleasure, for you to enjoy with me. But if you chose to make it your own, then you miss all of the scriptures and the tellings of the prophets and even Jesus himself, that our purpose is to surrender our will to the Father. That he would make right within us, restore unto us our salvation. And that salvation is simply much like a potter and the clay. And when the potter decides to form a teacup and puts tea in that cup, what is the purpose of the cup? I want you to return the pleasure to me. And in so doing, we have a right relationship. You fulfill what I've asked you to do. So what I'm asking you to do in worship is return to me that which I've put in you. In the Old Testament, that worship was certainly temple worship, or the priestly worship, or the prophets who admonished the people for not right worship or honoring God. But Jesus said, I give you a new covenant. This for the forgiveness of sins, the pouring out of my blood, the breaking of my body. We celebrate that in worship as communion. It's Not something that we know whether we should take all the time, every day, once a month. I do know this. If you haven't symbolically been in the gathering church and communed with God's people, then you are missing out. Then you are that son or daughter who has decided to just choose your own path, as if that's acceptable to God for you to drive his car or live on his earth or breathe his air, and you get the point. The good news is that's what the joy of worship is. Coming together as we would for any family gathering. That we get the privilege of ascribing worth back to God for his rich and wonderful blessings. When we serve and worship, we do it all the time. Some of the simple things we do in worship is communion. This past Sunday, we had 5 baptisms. We had people who said, I accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, and I want to tell people about it. And we're fulfilling that act of worship to ascribe not only worth to God in song or in communion, but with the whole self, like a wedding day, somebody proclaiming their love for the Lord. We celebrate that in the offering. The opportunity to give back a portion as God has given to us. And it's not because God's going to need that money to do something with that money. It is simply our ability to open our hands to receive what we give to God is what God will give back wonderfully to us in many extraordinary ways. But we make some poor judgments of worship when we assume it has nothing to do with our pocketbook. When Jesus says in Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. As if to say, if you can't return to me a portion of what I've given to you, then that is a strained relationship. And we're missing out on that together. Of course, we do other things in worship. We sing and we celebrate songs. I challenge our worship teams to consider making new songs. Psalm 33:1, sing to him a new song. And ultimately, we end the service with an invitation. And the invitation is as simple as it is as we started today. Can you step off of that dock? And can you decide this day to live in a direction, a new direction? Even if you've been a Christian for 30 years, is there a newness to your spirit that you can get into a relationship with God, a position with God, to let him take you to a new place? And sometimes that's true in relationships with others. People that you've decided you've been a certain way with, and you've even receded farther away from each other. And God says, I know they're on another shoreline, but if you get in with me, and you're willing to do things as I would lead you, it will go back to that person. It will be a relationship restored with grace, with intimacy, with authenticity. But I need you to get into this boat. Stop trying to find the way on your own. Step off of the dock from what is familiar, from the way maybe you've learned it from other people that isn't my way, from a world that chooses to do things in continuous rebellion. But with me, all things are possible. So I hope maybe you'll pull up the anchor from whatever it is that is familiar to you, and to join us in worship, even as these are supplemental videos for people who can't make it with us every week, or an outreach opportunity for those either still not sure about church. Dare to come into the gathering that is becoming as we set sail from the familiar.